The alarms blared like 1,000 screaming voices, tearing through the silence of the cockpit. Red lights flashed, casting an eerie glow on the controls. Outside, the vast emptiness of space was shattered by the sudden appearance of a massive alien fleet. Ships unlike anything humanity had ever seen loomed in the distance, their sleek, dark hulls glinting ominously under the faint light of distant stars. The pilot clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He hated this. He hated the chaos, the fear, the endless cycle of violence. But here he was, once again, strapped into a fighter ship, staring down the barrel of another war he didn't want to fight. "All units, prepare for engagement," came the cold, mechanical voice over the comms. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as they hovered over the controls. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had been thrust into a role he never asked for. But now, with Earth's survival on the line, he had no choice. The alien ships began to move, their formation shifting like a swarm of predatory insects. They were fast, faster than anything humanity had ever encountered. Within moments, the first wave of human ships was engulfed in a storm of laser fire. Explosions lit up the darkness, silent but deadly. "Stay focused," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Just stay alive." His ship darted through the battlefield, weaving between debris and enemy fire. He wasn't the best pilot, but he had something the others didn't, a deep, unshakable instinct for survival. It was what had kept him alive this long, even when everything around him was falling apart. A sudden burst of light caught his eye. One of the alien ships had broken away from the main fleet and was heading straight for him. He cursed under his breath and yanked the controls, sending his ship into a sharp dive. The alien ship followed, its weapons locking onto his position. Come on," he whispered, his eyes darting across the controls. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. But before he could think, a voice crackled over the comms. "Pilot, do you copy? This is command. We need you to buy us some time. The fleet is retreating." His stomach dropped. Retreating? They were leaving him behind. Again. "Copy that," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'll hold them off." The alien ship was closing in, its weapons charging. He could see the faint glow of its cannons, ready to unleash a deadly blast. He had seconds, maybe less, to make a move. And then, something inside him snapped. A surge of anger, of defiance, burned through his veins. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Not for a war he didn't believe in. With a roar, he slammed the controls forward, sending his ship into a reckless spin. The alien ship fired, but he was already moving, dodging the blast by mere inches. He looped around, coming up behind the enemy ship, and unleashed a barrage of fire. The alien ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its debris scattering into the void. For a moment, there was silence. He sat there, breathing heavily, his hands still gripping the controls. He had done it. He had survived. But as he looked out at the battlefield, at the countless ships still locked in combat, he knew this was only the beginning. The aliens weren't here to conquer. They weren't here to destroy. They were here for something else, something far more dangerous. And as the realization dawned on him, a cold dread settled in his chest. This wasn't just a battle. It was a warning. And humanity was running out of time. The pilot's ship drifted silently through the wreckage of the battle, its engines barely humming. The alien fleet had retreated, but the cost had been high. Dozens of human ships were lost, their broken hulls floating aimlessly in the cold void of space. He stared out at the destruction, his hands still gripping the controls, his mind racing. He had survived. Again. But for how long? The comms crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Pilot, this is command. Do you copy?" He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Copy. I'm here." "Good. We need you to return to base immediately. There's something you need to see." The tone in the voice sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the usual cold, detached command. There was fear there. Real fear. "Understood," he said, his voice steady despite the unease settling in his chest. "Heading back now." As he guided his ship toward the nearest human outpost, his thoughts drifted back to the battle. The aliens had been relentless, their tactics precise and calculated. But there was something strange about the way they fought. They hadn't gone for the kill, not immediately. It was almost as if they were testing humanity, probing for weaknesses. And then there was the ship he had destroyed. The way it had exploded, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a mistake. The outpost came into view, a small, heavily fortified station orbiting a distant moon. It was one of humanity's last lines of defense, a place where the remnants of Earth's military forces gathered to regroup and plan their next move. As he docked his ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The moment he stepped out of the cockpit, he was met by a group of soldiers. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow. They led him through the station's dimly lit corridors, past rows of wounded soldiers and shattered equipment, until they reached a sealed door. Inside, one of the soldiers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting for you." The door slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table lay the body of an alien. The pilot froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen the aliens from a distance, but up close, they were different. Their bodies were slender, almost fragile-looking, with smooth, gray skin and long, delicate limbs. Their faces were humanoid but eerily alien, with large, dark eyes and no visible mouth. But what struck him the most was the expression on the alien's face. It wasn't one of anger or hatred. It was one of fear. "We found it among the wreckage," a voice said, pulling him out of his thoughts. He turned to see a man in a military uniform standing in the corner of the room. His face was lined with age and exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "What is this?" the pilot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the alien's body. "We don't know much. But we do know one thing, they're not here to conquer us. They're running from something." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Running? From what? The man hesitated, his expression darkening. "We're not sure. But whatever it is, it's coming. And when it gets here, it won't stop until everything in its path is destroyed." The pilot stared at the alien's body, his mind racing. This changed everything. The battles, the destruction, the fear, it wasn't about humanity. It was about survival. And if the aliens, with their advanced technology and powerful ships, were running, then what chance did humanity have? "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. "We prepare. We fight. And we hope that, somehow, we can survive what's coming." The pilot nodded, but inside, he felt a growing sense of dread. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, for the first time, he understood why it was necessary. Because sometimes, the only way to survive was to fight. And humanity was running out of time. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, every corner of the outpost was buzzing with whispers of the alien's body and the terrifying truth it represented. The pilot moved through the crowded corridors, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, making every step feel heavier than the last. He reached the command center, a large, dimly lit room filled with screens and maps. A group of high-ranking officials stood around a table, their faces tense as they debated their next move. The pilot hesitated at the door, unsure if he should interrupt, but one of the officers spotted him and waved him in. "We've been waiting for you," the officer said, his voice grave. "We need to hear your account of the battle. Every detail matters." The pilot nodded and stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air almost too heavy to breathe. He took a deep breath and began to speak, recounting the battle, the alien ship he had destroyed, and the strange behavior of the enemy fleet. When he finished, there was a long silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. "This changes everything," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "If what you're saying is true, then we're not just fighting for Earth. We're fighting for the survival of our entire species." "But how do we fight something we don't even understand?" another officer asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We don't know what's coming. We don't know how to stop it." The room erupted into a heated debate, voices rising and overlapping as the officers argued over the best course of action. Some advocated for immediate action, for preparing for war on a scale humanity had never seen before. Others urged caution, warning against rushing into a conflict they knew nothing about. The pilot stood silently, his mind racing. He had always hated politics, hated the endless debates and power struggles. But now, as he listened to the officers argue, he realized that this was bigger than politics. This was about survival. "Enough," a voice suddenly boomed, cutting through the chaos. The room fell silent as a tall, imposing figure stepped forward. It was General Hayes, one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. His face was stern, his eyes sharp and commanding. "We don't have time for this," Hayes said, his voice calm but firm. "Every second we waste arguing is a second we lose preparing. We need to act, and we need to act now." He turned to the pilot, his gaze piercing. "You've seen them up close. You've fought them. What do you think we should do?" The pilot hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a leader. He was just a man who had been thrust into a war he didn't want to fight. But as he looked around the room, at the faces of the men and women who were depending on him, he knew he had to say something. "We need to unite," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "Not just as a military, but as a species. If we're going to survive this, we need to put aside our differences and work together. Because if we don't, we're all going to die." The room fell silent once again, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the officers began to nod, their expressions hardening with resolve. "He's right," Hayes said, breaking the silence. "We don't have a choice. We need to prepare for war, and we need to do it now." The pilot nodded, but inside, he felt a growing sense of dread. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, for the first time, he understood why it was necessary. Because sometimes, the only way to survive was to fight. The pilot stood at the edge of the docking bay, watching as the alien ship descended. It was smaller than the others he had seen, its sleek, dark hull glinting under the harsh lights of the outpost. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and curiosity swirling inside him. This was it, the moment humanity would come face to face with the beings they had been fighting just days ago. The ship landed with a soft hiss, its engines powering down. The bay fell silent, the air thick with tension. Soldiers lined the walls, their weapons at the ready, while scientists and diplomats stood nervously in the background. The pilot took a deep breath and stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the ship's hatch. It opened slowly, revealing a group of aliens. They were tall and slender, their gray skin smooth and almost glowing under the lights. Their large, dark eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The pilot could feel their gaze on him, and for a moment, he felt like a specimen under a microscope. One of the aliens stepped forward, its movements graceful and deliberate. It raised a hand, a gesture that seemed almost human, and spoke in a soft, melodic voice. The words were strange, unfamiliar, but the tone was clear. It was a greeting. A translator stepped forward, a small device in hand. "They say, they come in peace," the translator said, his voice trembling slightly. "They want to talk." The pilot nodded, his eyes never leaving the alien. "Tell them, we're listening." The alien spoke again, its voice calm and measured. The translator listened carefully, then turned to the pilot. "They say, they are sorry for the lives lost. They did not want to fight, but they had no choice. They are running from something much worse." The pilot's heart skipped a beat. He had heard this before, but hearing it from the aliens themselves made it feel more real, more urgent. "Ask them, what they're running from." The alien hesitated, its dark eyes narrowing slightly. Then it spoke again, its voice low and somber. The translator listened, his face pale. "They say, it is a force that consumes everything in its path. They call it, the Devourer. It has destroyed countless worlds, wiped out entire civilizations. And now, it is coming here." The words sent a chill through the room. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their grips tightening on their weapons. The scientists exchanged worried glances, while the diplomats whispered among themselves. The pilot felt a knot form in his stomach, a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. "What do they want from us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien spoke again, its tone more urgent this time. The translator nodded. "They say, they need our help. They believe that humanity's unique nature might be the key to stopping the Devourer. They want to form an alliance." The room erupted into murmurs, the tension rising as the implications of the aliens' words sank in. An alliance with the beings they had been fighting just days ago? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. But as the pilot looked at the alien, at the fear and desperation in its eyes, he knew they didn't have a choice. "Tell them, we'll consider it," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But we need to know more. We need to understand what we're up against." The alien nodded, its expression unreadable. It spoke again, its voice softer this time. The translator listened, then turned to the pilot. "They say, they will share what they know. But they warn us, time is running out." The pilot nodded, his mind racing. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, as he stood face to face with the aliens, he realized that this wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding, about finding common ground in the face of a greater threat. The pilot stood on the bridge of the human fleet's flagship, his eyes fixed on the massive viewscreen. The stars stretched out before him, calm and unchanging, but he knew the peace was an illusion. Somewhere out there, hidden in the darkness, the Devourer was coming. And when it arrived, it would bring destruction unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The alliance with the aliens had been uneasy at first. Trust didn't come easily, especially after the battles they had fought. But as the days passed, a fragile understanding began to form. The aliens shared their technology, their knowledge, and their fears. And humanity, in turn, prepared for the fight of their lives. "All ships report ready," a voice said over the comms. The pilot turned to see the fleet commander, a stern-faced woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had been skeptical of the alliance, but even she couldn't deny the urgency of the situation. "Good," the pilot said, his voice steady. "Let's hope it's enough." The commander nodded, her expression grim. "We've done everything we can. Now it's up to them." Them. The Devourer. The pilot still didn't fully understand what it was. The aliens had described it as a force of nature, a relentless, unstoppable entity that consumed everything in its path. But words couldn't capture the sheer scale of the threat. Only seeing it would make it real. And then, it happened. A ripple in space, faint at first, like a distant echo. The sensors picked it up immediately, their alarms blaring as the ripple grew stronger. The pilot's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the view screen, his breath catching in his throat. "It's here," the commander said, her voice tight with tension. "All ships, prepare for engagement." The ripple intensified, distorting the stars as if the fabric of space itself was being torn apart. And then, it emerged, a massive, shadowy form, its edges shifting and blurring like smoke. It was unlike anything the pilot had ever seen, a living nightmare made real. The Devourer. The fleet moved into position, their weapons charging as the shadowy form loomed closer. The alien ships, sleek and dark, flanked the human vessels, their presence a silent reminder of the alliance they had formed. The pilot gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white as he braced himself for what was to come. "Fire!" the commander shouted. The fleet unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they streaked toward the Devourer. The pilot watched, his heart in his throat, as the blast struck the shadowy form. For a moment, it seemed to falter, its edges flickering like a dying flame. But then, it surged forward, faster than anyone had anticipated. The human and alien ships scattered, their formations breaking as the Devourer closed in. Its tendrils lashed out, striking a human cruiser and tearing through its hull like paper. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its debris scattering into the void. "Fall back," the commander shouted, her voice tinged with panic. "Regroup and focus fire." The pilot's ship darted through the chaos, weaving between the Devourer's attacks. He could feel the fear in the air, the desperation as the fleet struggled to hold their ground. But even as the losses mounted, he refused to give up. He couldn't. "We need to hit it harder," he said, his voice tight with determination. "We need to find its weak spot." The commander nodded, her expression hardening. "Do it. And pray it works." The pilot guided his ship into position, his hands steady on the controls. He could see the Devourer's core now, a pulsing, dark mass at the center of its form. It was the key, he realized. The only way to stop it. "All ships, target the core," he shouted over the comms. "Aim everything you've got at it." The fleet obeyed, their weapons locking onto the core as they unleashed a final, desperate barrage. The pilot held his breath as the blast struck, the impact sending shockwaves through the Devourer's form. For a moment, it seemed to shudder, its edges flickering as if it might collapse. But then, with a roar that echoed through the void, it surged forward again, its tendrils lashing out with renewed fury. The pilot's ship was thrown off course, the impact sending him crashing into the console. He struggled to regain control, his vision blurring as alarms blared around him. "We're losing too many ships," the commander shouted, her voice filled with despair. "We can't hold it off." The pilot clenched his fists, his mind racing. They couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "We have to keep fighting," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "We have to buy more time." The commander nodded, her expression grim. "Then we fight. To the last ship. To the last breath." The pilot took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the Devourer. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, as he stared into the face of the enemy, he understood why it was necessary. Because sometimes, the only way to survive was to fight. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was deafening. The pilot sat in the cockpit of his ship, his hands still gripping the controls, his mind numb. The Devourer had retreated, its shadowy form vanishing into the void as suddenly as it had appeared. But the cost of the victory was written in the wreckage that surrounded him, shattered ships, broken bodies, and the lingering echoes of screams that would haunt him forever. He took a deep breath, his chest tight with grief and guilt. They had survived, but at what cost? Dozens of ships were lost, their crews gone in an instant. The alien fleet had suffered heavy losses too, their sleek, dark vessels now drifting lifelessly among the debris. The Alliance had held, but the price had been steep. The comms crackled to life, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Pilot, this is command. Do you copy?" He hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice hoarse. "Copy. I'm here." "Good. We need you to return to base immediately. There's something you need to see." The tone in the voice sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the usual cold, detached command. There was something else there, something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Sorrow? He wasn't sure. "Understood," he said, his voice steady despite the unease settling in his chest. "Heading back now." As he guided his ship toward the outpost, his thoughts drifted back to the battle. The Devourer had been unlike anything he had ever faced, a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable. But there had been a moment, just before it retreated, when he had seen something in its core. A flicker of light, faint but unmistakable. It had been there for only a second, but it had given him hope. Hope that they could fight back. Hope that they could win. The outpost came into view, its lights dimmed as if in mourning. The docking bay was filled with ships, some damaged, others barely holding together. The pilot landed his ship and stepped out, his legs trembling as he walked through the bay. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt metal, the sounds of crying and whispered prayers filling the silence. He made his way to the command center, his heart heavy with dread. The room was filled with officers and scientists, their faces pale and drawn. In the center of the room was a holographic display, showing the aftermath of the battle. The wreckage, the losses, the sheer scale of the destruction. The pilot stared at the display, his stomach churning. He had known the cost would be high, but seeing it laid out like this made it feel more real, more personal. "We lost a lot of good people out there," the fleet commander said, her voice breaking the silence. "But we held the line. We stopped the Devourer." The pilot nodded, but inside, he felt no sense of victory. They had stopped the Devourer, but for how long? It had retreated, but it wasn't gone. And when it returned, would they be ready? "We need to prepare," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "We need to find a way to fight back." The commander nodded, her expression grim. "We're working on it. But we need time. And we need your help." The pilot hesitated, his mind racing. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, as he looked around the room, at the faces of the men and women who had sacrificed so much, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady. The commander stepped forward, her eyes sharp and focused. "We need you to lead. We need you to show us the way." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Led? He wasn't a leader. He was just a man who had been thrust into a war he didn't want to fight. But as he looked around the room, at the hope and determination in the eyes of the people around him, he knew he had no choice. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't do it alone." The commander nodded, her expression softening. "You're not alone. We're in this together." The pilot took a deep breath, his mind racing. They had survived the first strike, but the war was far from over. And as he looked out at the wreckage, at the lives that had been lost, he knew that the cost of victory would only grow higher. But they had no choice. They had to keep fighting. For their survival. For their future. The pilot sat in the dimly lit room, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The images flickered before him, data from the battle, scans of the Devourer, and fragments of alien technology. He had been studying them for hours, searching for answers, for anything that could help them fight back. But the more he looked, the more questions he had. The door slid open, and the fleet commander stepped in, her face pale and drawn. "We've found something," she said, her voice tight with tension. "Something you need to see." The pilot stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" The commander hesitated, her expression unreadable. "It's easier if you see for yourself." She led him through the outpost's corridors, past rows of wounded soldiers and shattered equipment, until they reached a sealed door. The pilot recognized it immediately. It was the same room where they had first examined the alien's body. His stomach churned as the door slid open, revealing a group of scientists huddled around a table. On the table was a small, glowing object, a fragment of alien technology, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. The scientists stepped aside as he approached, their faces grim. "We found this among the wreckage," one of them said, his voice trembling. It's a data storage device. And it contains something we weren't expecting." The pilot frowned, his mind racing. "What is it?" The scientist hesitated, then activated the device. A holographic image flickered to life, showing a series of symbols and diagrams. The pilot stared at them, his heart sinking as he realized what they were. "It's a map," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A map of the Devourer's path." The scientist nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. But it's more than that. It's a warning." The pilot's stomach dropped. "A warning? From who?" The scientist hesitated, then pointed to a series of symbols at the edge of the map. "From them. The aliens. They've been trying to tell us something. Something we didn't understand until now." The pilot leaned closer, his eyes scanning the symbols. They were strange, unfamiliar, but as he looked at them, a cold dread settled in his chest. "What does it say?" The scientist took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "It says, the Devourer isn't a natural phenomenon. It's a weapon. Created by an ancient civilization. A civilization that wanted to end all war, by destroying warlike species." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at the hologram, his mind racing. The Devourer wasn't just a force of nature. It was a weapon. A weapon designed to wipe out civilizations like humanity. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why would they do that?" The scientist shook his head, his expression dark. "We don't know. But the aliens, they've been running from it for centuries. They've tried to fight it, to stop it, but nothing works. And now, it's coming for us." The pilot clenched his fists, his mind reeling. This changed everything. The battles, the losses, the fear, it wasn't just about survival. It was about something much bigger. Something much darker. "We need to tell the others," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "We need to prepare." The scientist nodded, his expression grim. "We're working on it. But we need time. And we need your help." The pilot hesitated, his mind racing. He had always hated war, hated the violence and the destruction. But now, as he looked at the hologram, at the truth it revealed, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady. The scientist stepped forward, his eyes sharp and focused. "We need you to lead. We need you to show us the way." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Led? He wasn't a leader. He was just a man who had been thrust into a war he didn't want to fight. But as he looked around the room, at the hope and determination in the eyes of the people around him, he knew he had no choice. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice trembling. But I can't do it alone. The scientist nodded, his expression softening. You're not alone. We're in this together. The pilot took a deep breath, his mind racing. They had survived the first strike, but the war was far from over. And as he looked at the hologram, at the truth it revealed, he knew that the cost of victory would only grow higher. But they had no choice. They had to keep fighting. For their survival. For their future. The outpost was alive with activity, the air thick with tension and urgency. Soldiers rushed through the corridors, their faces set with determination. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged ships, while scientists pored over data, searching for any advantage they could find. The pilot moved through the chaos, his mind racing as he prepared for what was to come. The Devourer was coming. The scans had confirmed it. The massive, shadowy form was moving closer, its path unmistakable. They had days, maybe hours, before it reached them. And when it did, it would bring destruction unlike anything they had ever seen. The pilot reached the command center, where the fleet commander and a group of officers were gathered around a holographic display. The map of the Devourer's path glowed before them, its ominous presence a constant reminder of the threat they faced. We've done everything we can, the commander said, her voice tight with tension. But it's not enough. We need a plan. A real plan. The pilot nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. He had been thinking about it non-stop, searching for a way to fight back. And then, it hit him, a desperate, reckless idea that might just work. We need to hit it at its core, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. We need to destroy it from the inside. The room fell silent, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. That's suicide, one of them said, his voice trembling. No one could survive that. The pilot clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew it was risky. He knew it might not work. But what other choice did they have? We don't have a choice, he said, his voice firm. If we don't try, we're all going to die. And if we do try, at least we have a chance. The commander nodded, her expression grim. He's right. We need to take the risk. The officers hesitated, their faces pale with fear. But one by one, they nodded, their resolve hardening. They had come too far to give up now. What do you need? The commander asked, her eyes sharp and focused. The pilot took a deep breath, his mind racing. I need a ship. A fast one. And I need a team. Volunteers only. The commander nodded, her expression softening. You'll have it. But, are you sure about this? The pilot hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure. He was terrified. But as he looked around the room, at the faces of the men and women who had sacrificed so much, he knew he had no choice. I'm sure, he said, his voice steady. We have to try. The commander nodded, her expression grim. Then we'll prepare. And we'll pray it works. The pilot took a deep breath, his mind racing. They had survived so much, fought so hard. But now, as he prepared for the final stand, he knew that the cost of victory would be higher than ever. But they had no choice. They had to keep fighting. For their survival. For their future. The pilot stood at the helm of the small, fast ship, his hands steady on the controls. Behind him, a team of volunteers, humans and aliens alike, prepared for the mission. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. But there was no fear in their eyes, only determination. They had come too far to turn back now. The Devourer loomed in the distance, its massive, shadowy form blotting out the stars. It was closer than ever, its presence a constant reminder of the threat they faced. The pilot took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The final stand. All systems are ready, one of the crew members said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. We're good to go. The pilot nodded, his mind racing. They had one chance. One shot to destroy the Devourer and save everything they held dear. He glanced at the team, their faces set with resolve. They were ready. And so was he. Let's do this, he said, his voice firm. The ship surged forward, its engines roaring as it streaked toward the Devourer. The massive form grew larger with every passing second, its shadowy tendrils reaching out like the arms of a predator. The pilot guided the ship through the chaos, his hands steady on the controls. They had to get close. Close enough to strike at its core. The Devourer's defenses activated, its tendrils lashing out at the ship. The pilot dodged and weaved, his heart pounding as the ship rocked under the impact. But he didn't falter. He couldn't. Not now. We're almost there, one of the crew members shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The pilot gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed on the Devourer's core. It was pulsing, a dark, ominous mass at the center of its form. He could feel the energy radiating from it, a force so powerful it made his skin crawl. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. Prepare the weapon, he shouted, his voice tight with tension. The crew moved quickly, their hands flying over the controls as they armed the device. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate gamble that might just work. But it was their only hope. The ship shuddered as another tendril struck, the impact sending sparks flying through the cabin. The pilot struggled to maintain control, his hands gripping the controls as the ship rocked violently. But he didn't give up. He couldn't. We're in position, one of the crew members shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The pilot took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment of truth. Fire, he shouted, his voice firm. The weapon activated, a blinding burst of energy surging toward the Devourer's core. The pilot held his breath as the energy struck, the impact sending shockwaves through the massive form. For a moment, it seemed to shudder, its edges flickering as if it might collapse. And then, with a roar that echoed through the void, it exploded. The shockwave hit the ship, sending it spinning out of control. The pilot struggled to regain control, his vision blurring as alarms blared around him. But as the ship stabilized, he looked out at the view screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The Devourer was gone. The crew erupted into cheers, their voices filled with relief and joy. But the pilot sat silently, his mind racing. They had done it. They had destroyed the Devourer. But at what cost? As the ship returned to the outpost, the pilot couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that settled in his chest. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. The losses, the sacrifices, the pain, it was all too much. He stepped out of the ship, his legs trembling as he walked through the docking bay. The outpost was alive with activity, the air thick with celebration. But the pilot couldn't join in. He couldn't forget what they had lost. He found himself standing at the edge of the outpost, staring out at the stars. The Devourer was gone, but the scars it had left behind would never fade. And as he stood there, he realized something that changed everything. War wasn't the answer. Violence, destruction, hatred, they only led to more pain, more loss. The real victory wasn't in defeating the enemy. It was in understanding, in finding common ground, in learning to live together. And as he looked out at the stars, he knew that humanity had a choice. They could continue down the path of war, or they could choose a different path. A path of peace, of unity, of hope. The pilot took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the lesson he had learned. They had survived the Devourer, but the real challenge was just beginning. And as he turned away from the stars, he knew that the future was in their hands. And humanity was ready.